The local elections were the first real test of Keir Starmer's leadership, and it wasn't good. The Tories took control of another dozen councils and got an extra 200 councillors elected. So what's gone wrong for the party? Is this part of a wider political realignment, or would a new leader do the trick? I'm joined now by Andrew Adonis, a minister in Tony Blair's government, along with Paul Embery, a current Labour member, a lifelong Labour member, and a former executive at the Fire Brigades Union, also an Unherd columnist. Paul, what's your diagnosis of what went wrong in Hartlepool?
Well, what went wrong is that the Labour Party has increasingly, over recent years, become a middle-class pressure group, and the old coalition on which the party was based and on which it enjoyed much of its success was Hartlepool and Hampstead. It was, yes, a layer of middle-class, white-collar people who supported Labour's ideas of a more egalitarian economy, but also the blue-collar working-class base. And places like Hartlepool in provincial and post-industrial Britain just look at the Labour Party nowadays and think, actually, you don't look like me, you don't sound like me, you don't share my priorities. You tried to overturn the referendum result when we voted leave. Why should we vote for you? So there's a huge disconnect, which has been entirely self-inflicted by the Labour Party.
And Paul, do you think the choice of candidate played a role in this? Because much has been made of the fact they were someone who had supported a second referendum.
I think the choice of candidate obviously wasn't ideal. I mean, Paul Williams was an Uber Remainer, and in a constituency that voted 70% Leave. And in many of these places, by the way, people are still brimming with anger at the Labour Party over the fact that they tried to overturn their vote. But the problem is Labour wasn't exactly spoilt for choice. This is the problem for the Labour Party. That old working class element, which was once the backbone of the party, people had come up through the trade union movement, people had worked in manual labour, people who were based in blue-collar constituencies and were part of the Labour movement. They're just not there in any serious number anymore. So I would imagine if Labour did want to select a Leave candidate for Hartlepool, it would have had a pretty hard job to find someone. That's the problem.
So do you think, Andrew, that the choice of a pro-Remain candidate in a seat that voted 70% for Brexit was a big factor in this, or not?
No, I don't think it was at all. And indeed, I think it swings and roundabouts for the candidate. Paul Williams is a local GP, and he was in many ways an extremely attractive candidate. The Tory candidate came from Yorkshire, and anyone who knows Hartlepool and Teesside knows that the only thing worse than having somebody from Hampstead is somebody from Yorkshire. So the idea that the candidates, the local candidates, played a role, I don't think is correct. I think, as I say, the two people on the ballot paper in Hartlepool were Boris Johnson and Keir Starmer, and they went for Boris Johnson. And the history of elections, if you look at polling, all the way back to the beginning of polling, is that almost without exception, the party that wins elections is the party that has the more popular leader. And in the head-to-head on the leadership stakes at the moment, it's Boris Johnson, not Keir Starmer.
Paul?
I disagree profoundly with Andrew that this is essentially just really a question of leadership. This is not a question of leadership. Changing the leader in the Labour Party at the moment would essentially be reshuffling the deck chairs on the Titanic. This is a question about the Labour Party's DNA. This is a question about the culture, about the structure of the Labour Party. It runs far wider than questions of leadership and party management. And the idea that all we need to do is return to, some sort of reheated Blairism, I think that, for all that parts of his essay were right in the New Statesman this week, Tony Blair, show a bit of humility. And I think Andrew needs to show a bit of humility. It was that kind of Blairite embrace of the global market and everything that went with it, the loose immigration policy. It was the promotion of cosmopolitan liberalism over everything else, which alienated blue-collar communities in the first place. For all the good that New Labour did, it completely failed to understand the communitarian impulse in many of those communities. People's desire for social solidarity, their desire for stability, a sense of belonging, the acute effects that globalisation had in the first decade of this century cannot be overestimated. And what Blairism did effectively is it laid in train what we're seeing now in terms of the woke agenda, where the liberal left effectively just demonised millions of working class people as racist and nativist. We saw it in Brexit, we saw it well before Brexit, and that anger was storing up for years in these communities, and I know it because I lived in one.
Andrew, do you think it's time that you should show some humility? Paul mentions that Tony Blair article in the New Statesman this week where he says the party has gone too far when it comes to the so-called woke end, but surely that does link back to the Blair era to a degree.
Well, Paul sprayed so many different claims and allegations, it's very hard to get a handle on it. And in particular, it's almost impossible to get a sense of where you would go in future on what he said, because he thinks that Corbyn wasn't the answer, he thinks that Blair wasn't the answer, he thinks we've both on the one hand been too woke, whereas in fact actually Tony, if you read his article, has a critique of the problem of Labour being seen to be extremist on some of those issues. All I would make is two observations. Labour won 3 elections when Tony Blair was leader, and it swept all of the areas we're talking about. It held almost all of the seats in the North East when he was leader, and that includes in his 3rd election. So to blame him for what happened 15 years later, I think is just straightforwardly unhistorical. And though times change, approaches don't change, and the big problem that Labour has is it does not have a leadership that is capable of appealing to the North and South. Now, of course, it's true that a leader has to have policies and ideas. This idea, though, that the policies and ideas of Blair were somehow the destructive of community and social progress, though, again, is completely unhistorical. It was that Labour government that substantially rebuilt the public services, massive investment in health, education. Remember, Tony Blair's mantra was education, education, education. A huge expansion of opportunity. The big problem in communities like Hartlepool, which I know well, I come off a council estate, I've got a pretty good idea what working class people think too, is that though Labour did a brilliant job of rebuilding the public services, what was needed and is needed is a viable economy, jobs, businesses, industry in these communities. And that's particularly true in the North East, which has had a really terrible 40 years now since the decline of the mass industries.
Paul, does some of this come back to Brexit? Some Labour campaigns have said it did not come up on the doorstep, but clearly it has been perhaps the point where lots of people who felt disillusioned with Labour finally made the jump.
The Labour's policy of a second referendum was electoral suicide, frankly. It was only going to end in electoral oblivion. If you look at these statistics, 50 of the 54 seats that went from Labour to the Tories at the last election voted Brexit. The idea that Labour was ever going to get away with saying to millions of working class people, actually, we think you got it wrong, we're going to make you go through the vote again, was frankly insane. It certainly isn't the only factor as to why there's been a huge disconnect between Labour and the working class, but it was a big one. And I would simply say to Andrew, look, the statistics show that Labour has been losing the working class since around about the turn of the century. You know, the C2 DEs have been voting for Labour less and less, and Labour has become more of a middle class party in terms of attracting the ABC ones. And you know, as I said, the acute effects of globalisation in some of these communities, in terms of rapid demographic change, in terms of deindustrialisation, in terms of people's sense of place and belonging being violated, cannot be overestimated. And you know, the truth is now that people in those communities look at the Labour Party, and I'm a member of the Labour Party, by the way, so it pains me to say this, but they look at a party now that is a party effectively for the professional and managerial classes, a party for student radicals, a party for Twitter, a party for social activists, a party that's rooted in the fashionable cities and the university towns. And I think that this is potentially a paradigm shift. You know, in 1983, even when Labour was crushed at the general election under Michael Foot against Margaret Thatcher, Labour managed to retain much of its working class base. That isn't happening now. I mean, this is a serious and seismic shift for the Labour Party. And unless something happens quite urgently, which goes far beyond the question of leadership, then the party will effectively relegate itself to a middle class pressure group.
Andrew, do you think Labour might just have to look at the landscape and think that if there is a realignment of politics going on, their future lies in commuter towns, in the cities, and potentially in Tory home counties. There are some encouraging results for the Labour Party when it came to the later results in the local elections.
Well, I actually agree with Paul that the moment Labour gives up being a national party, it is heading for oblivion. It's either a national party or it becomes a small pressure group. I think its history is wrong. Labour held its working class vote through all of Tony Blair's 3 elections, and indeed our problem in the 3rd election was we had a loss to the Lib Dems in the 3rd election because of Iraq, and Iraq wasn't an issue with working class voters at all. But on his point about it not being leadership, the truth is, like many political discussions, you can't be sure because we don't know what the counterfactual would be. Labour has not had an effective and popular leader since Tony Blair. Every leader we've had since, all 4 leaders we've had since, have been, as the polls show and as all of the analysis of election shows, they have all been less popular than their Tory counterpart. Gordon Brown was less popular than David Cameron. Ed Miliband was less popular than David Cameron. Theresa May was more popular, amazingly, than Jeremy Corbyn. And Boris Johnson ran rings round Corbyn in the 2019 election. So my proposition to you, which is that when Labour has had a good, effective, strong, centrist leader who's able to mobilise north and south, working class and middle class, that's led to success, is demonstrated by Tony Blair. Paul says it's not the case now. All I can say is since Tony Blair went, every leader of the Labour Party has been weaker, less effective and less nationally unifying than the Conservative leader. So it may not be a bad place to start to get a popular leader.
Andrew, I just wondered when you mentioned obviously the party losing working class voters, do you think the Brexit position that both you and Tony Blair adopted has helped keep working class voters on side?
No, I don't actually. If you look at the votes, and indeed if you look at the Brexit vote, half of the Brexit vote was in the home counties. It wasn't in traditional working class areas at all. The big problem was that for the last 5 years, Labour has been leaderless on the issue of Europe. We had Jeremy Corbyn leading during the 2016 referendum, who was sitting on the fence, essentially. I think he made one speech in the entire campaign, and then he said he was moderately in favour of Remain, but not strongly. And of course, he then sat on the fence for the whole of the next 4 years. When you've got one party that has a clear and emphatic and well-led campaign, and you've got another party that has a weak, flabby position which is untenable in its own terms because Corbyn was facing both ways. Surprise, surprise, it's the strong leader that wins and it's the weak leader that loses, and I'm afraid...
Are you saying, Andrew, can I just intervene now? Are you saying that had Labour been more passionate about the second referendum and less, ambivalent, that actually we wouldn't have lost millions of those working class votes, that actually the way to have gone would have been to be more stridently pro-EU and more stridently in favour of blocking the referendum result, and actually the Hartlepols of this world would have stayed on board with the Labour Party. It seems to me what you're saying.
Well, again, we don't know because there wasn't a second referendum.
I think we can hazard a pretty good guess, don't you?
At the time, show that if there was a second referendum, there would have been a majority to stay in the EU. But because there wasn't the second referendum, we don't know. But if you're asking me, do I think we should have had a second referendum, and would the second referendum have built a new Labour coalition in alliance with the Greens and the Lib Dems and indeed the Nationalists in favour of staying in the EU, which would have marginalised the Conservatives and the Brexit Party? It is my view that that's what would have happened. It would have also
marginalised millions of blue-collar working class voters, Andrew. It would also have marginalised our core vote.
We would have won, is the point, and that builds a new core vote. But unfortunately, we had Jeremy Corbyn. We didn't have the second referendum. Instead, we had Boris Johnson, who got to a second election before a second referendum, and the election was a choice between Boris Johnson and Jeremy Corbyn as Prime Minister, and that was a film that only ever had one ending, I'm afraid.
I think it would be an utter betrayal of the Labour Party's entire purpose to say, actually, what we really need to do is to build a new coalition around young people, people in the cities, graduates, people who are pro-EU, in alliance with the Greens and the Lib Dems, and that's our new base. Actually, the reason the Labour Party was set up in the first place, as you know, was to represent the voiceless in society, the people living in the poorer parts of our nation, the people in industrial communities like Hartlepool. And the idea that because we couldn't carry them over the idea of a second referendum. Well, we should just write them off and concentrate on a new base. I think really would be a betrayal of everything we're supposed to stand for in the movement. But you may not be what you said, Andrew. But that would be the logical conclusion of what.
No, it's not. It's neither what I said nor is it the conclusion. It's my view that if we'd been more successfully led, we would have been able to build a coalition that included the Lib Dems, the Greens, and the working class in communities like
around the demand for a second referendum.
It's because we were badly led that we were unable to do that, and that's the reason why Boris Johnson, preposterously, is now the champion of the working class in Hartlepool.
Andrew, do you think with hindsight perhaps the mistake Labour made was not to support Theresa May's Brexit deal? There has been the point made that had they done so, the Tory party would be divided, potentially imploding, and you could have kept on to some of those voters who had voted for Brexit but also backed Labour.
No, the mistake in hindsight was to elect Jeremy Corbyn as the Labour Party leader in 2015 and then to allow him to fight a second election in 2019. Whenever the British people were faced with a choice as who they wanted as Prime Minister and Jeremy Corbyn was on the ballot paper, they were always going to go for the Conservative. Even a Conservative as weak as Theresa May at the end of the 2017 election was significantly more popular than Jeremy Corbyn. And Boris Johnson was head and shoulders above Jeremy Corbyn by the end of the 2019 election, both as a leader but also on economic policy, which is the most important policy that people fight elections on, where Labour's £1 trillion nationalisation programme, which by the way would have offered working class voters in the north almost nothing in terms of better public services or better jobs, that was again always going to end in disaster. It's because Labour hasn't been able to find a good leader since Tony Blair that we're in this mess. Until we put this right, I'm afraid we'll continue in it.